Okay, welcome everybody. We've got about 16 people signed on this thing so far. I just wanted to give everyone sort of a little orientation here. This is Clay Trauernicht. I think I know most of you folks that have signed up and are signed on. But the way this works is that you guys are all on as attendees. And you have the ability to kind of raise your hand, but I have control basically over whether you have whether you can speak or not. And so what we're going to do is kind of go through the presentation. We're going to hear from Dr. Tamara Ticktin, who's here with me at University of Hawaii, and then Amy Tsuneyoshi from Honolulu Board of Water Supply, who's at her office. And so this is the first time the two of them have done a webinar, I believe, and we're sort of playing around with this GoToWebinar is new for me at least, and so bear with us, but I think it should run fairly smoothly. And so here, let's see, let me start this, and then, all right, so we'll get going here. I'm going to begin things with a little introduction, but you guys probably got the idea from the title. We're talking about this fire that happened in 2003 in the Waianaes and the ridge between Makaha Valley and Waianae Kai. And we'll get into some of the details. Amy's going to present a bit about the incident itself and the response to that, and then I'll pass it to Tamara after that to kind of talk about the results. We just surveyed it last month, literally, so this is really sort of fresh off the press. And so we'll go through the presentation, then afterwards we'll have questions. You guys should have the option to kind of raise your hand when we get to the question stage, and then I can actually turn your mics on. Yeah, so we'll get started here. Okay, so thanks for coming once again. I'm just going to give a little intro about fire in Hawaii, sort of part of, and sort of what this webinar is sort of part of as well. As many of you may be familiar with this is kind of how we've been advertising this. I sort of the project lead on the Pacific Fire Exchange, but what the Pacific Fire Exchange really is this kind of collaborative effort between Cooperative Extension Program here at University of Hawaii, Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, and the Institute of Pacific Islands Forestry. And we started this actually before I was even hired on in 2012. We just got, actually yesterday, the announcement that we're going to have continued funding through 2020. The idea here is just to kind of increase collaboration, increase the kind of availability of technical information on fire management. And what we're really trying to do is get research to be addressing questions that are relevant towards management on the ground. That's kind of the whole goal. The main sponsor is a Joint Fire Science Program, and that's really what they want to see. They fund research, but they also want to see that research be applied. And so a little bit about fire regime, just to kind of get us on the same page. I use this slide like all the time, so if people have seen this before, I apologize, but basically fire is kind of what makes fire happen on the landscape is pretty simple. You need an ignition source, which in Hawaii tends to be people by and large. We do get occasional lightning strikes. You need the right climate, so not too wet, not too dry. You know, if it's too dry, you just don't have any fuels to burn. And then vegetation. So depending on what kind of vegetation you've got, and I think all of us here in Hawaii at least are familiar with the problems that we have with these non-native grasses. They ignite very easily and they carry fire very quickly. It gets much more complicated when a fire is actually burning. So, you know, in the moment, you get shifts in weather, the effects of topography, and then those fuels, different fuel types will respond differently to changes in the weather. And so it gets really complicated when a fire is burning. But over time, as fires occur on the landscape again and again, that's kind of really what we're talking about with fire regime. So how frequent they are, how intensely they burn, etc. And what we're interested in all cases here in Hawaii and everywhere else is essentially how fire is affecting the resources that we're interested in, or what threat it poses to those resources, right? So I always like to say this when, you know, fire in and of itself is interesting, but we don't really care too much about it until it's, we think about it in juxtaposition or in the context of resources that we value. Uh-oh, hand raised. Carolyn. Carolyn, is there a question? Is there, are you guys on?
I can't see any slides. Are you presenting something?
Oh, thank you guys. Jeez. Main screen.
All I can see is the 14. There, yay! Now it came
Oh,
up. Thank you.
Guys. I should have checked in already. So I didn't get too far ahead of myself here, though. So I'll just back up. And this is the context that I'm trying to explain. So hopefully it didn't really miss too much. Talk about technical difficulties. Thank you, Carolyn. I'm going to mute you back. Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions or concerns before I kind of jump back in now that you actually have some visual context here? I apologize for that. All right. Let's see. Okay. All right. Looks like we're back on track. Sorry about that, folks. This is like what happens when we're sort of just talking at our computer. Okay. So like I was saying, it's really what we're trying to do is understand these factors. It's really important to get our heads around these sort of the causes, what drives fire occurrence, because it informs what we can do in the context of management. And so this is this informational sort of idea we've been working on with Melissa, who I work with at Pacific Fire Exchange. This idea that, you know, we tend to live in the world of suppression when it comes to fire. We tend to be kind of on the reactive side. A fire happens and we're going to put it out. And what I think a lot of us together have been talking about is how these other pieces, so prevention is really talking about how do you minimize the ignition part. So human-started ignitions, and that usually tends to be through outreach and education, restricting activity during times when the fire risk is high, feeding into mitigation, which is actually the management actions we take to either facilitate suppression efforts or just reduce fire risks through doing things like fuel breaks and fuels reduction. And then today, obviously, we're talking about post-fire response, which is like, what do we do after the fire burns? What happens to the landscape after the fire burns? And I think for Hawaii in particular, we're trying to make this connection between post-fire response and back into mitigation, because we kind of have seen this cycle again and again where a fire burns from a grassland into a forest area, and what establishes in the place of forest tends to be more grass, and that increases in turn the risk of future fires. So what we're trying to kind of link here, or make this connection, that our post-fire response feeds back into this idea of reducing vulnerability and being proactive for future fire risk. What do we know as far as fire regimes in Hawaii? Well, this is we actually have the luxury of having a pretty long-term data set for fire occurrence. We know that the area affected by fire, so this is the area burned on the side here per year, going back to 1904 and up to 2012 at least, where we have complete statewide records. We know that area burned is increasing. So we know that things are changing. And we also can kind of see sort of in contemporary times where this is happening and what resources are being affected. So this is a really coarse assessment of this, but we have perimeters. So these are actually mapped fires for fires greater than 100 acres. This is a product that the USGS put together, and we've been trying to add onto this from agency efforts to map these fires. And you can see that most fires happen in these shrublands and grasslands, non-native ecosystems. So this is kind of your typical guinea grass, buffalo grass, fountain grass, haole koa kind of landscapes. But a substantial part of these fires are affecting forests. So 14% kind of across that 10-year time span has been happening in forest areas. And so this is just lumping non-native and native forests together. But Yeah, so we do see some forests affected, and we also can kind of look at what the sources of these fires are. This is total ignitions over we have records for from the county and state, so it's DOFA and then county fire agencies, and you can see that it's pretty much lines right up with population size. So the more population density, higher population density, the more fire ignitions you get. And how other things affect this, and what the sort of bigger picture, a complete picture of this is this dynamic between human-caused ignitions, these expanding grasslands, and in the rest of the Pacific, these are called savannas. So that's kind of ties back into that grass fire cycle, and then drought. And we know sort of that year to year, the amount of fire area that's burned varies a lot, and it's really driven by these cycles like El Nino, where you have pretty significant droughts in the wintertime associated with El Nino. So for example, that's been linked to larger increases in area burn. So just a little bit of a background on what we're talking about, the context, and I'm going to pass it to Amy to talk about the effort that really was kind of surrounding the fire that happened at Kumaiko up on the ridge in the Waianae.
Okay, thanks, Clay. So in 2003, a coalition of agencies, community groups, and organizations began a discussion on the need to protect natural resources in Waianae Kai and eventually Makaha. As a result, the Waianae Kai Community Forest Project was formed, and the partners, which included Department of Land and Natural Resources, Division of Forestry and Wildlife, Honolulu Board of Water Supply, Ka'ala Farm, Mohala Ikawai, and Ilio Ula Okalani Coalition, gathered to sign a MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, at the Board of Water Supply. Associate partners also attended, which included Nature Conservancy of Hawaii, the University of Hawaii at Manoa Botany Department, and the Oahu Pig Hunters Association. This group was the precursor to the Waianae Mountains Watershed Partnership, which was formed in 2010. So on the next slide, unfortunately, about a week after we signed this MOU, a fire broke out on the saddle between Waianae Kai and Makaha. And due to the remote location, helicopter water drops were used to deploy water drops to extinguish the fire. On the next slide, October 1st, a group of us went out to assess the burn site, only to discover the fire was still smoldering and spreading through underground tree roots. So the next day, the state sent out a crew to put out the fire. And it was estimated that the fire was about 7 to 9 acres. And there were a few casualties of the fire as it burned through fairly intact native forest. Native tree snails and endangered plants were found charred. And while the exact cause was not determined, a remains of a fire ring was found in the center of the burn area. So the next slide shows the remnants of the fire ring. Oh, maybe not. So, oh, that's okay. So this picture shows a before and after of a fairly intact native forest and what happens after the fire burned through the area. So on the left, you'll see li'i koa, the ganya sedge, and some other natives. And on the right-hand side, it's pretty much burned to the ground. So this picture was taken from the Pinnacle Rocks, looking back towards Mount Ka'ala. And the valley on the left is Makaha, and on the right is Waianae Kai. And you can see how kind of steep both sides are. So, it was a multi-agency effort to get all of these soil erosion control materials in place. And it was thanks to the Oahu forester at that time, Brent Leesmeyer, who came up with the idea of using these soil erosion control materials, which was coconut coir in jute netting and straw wattle in burlap bags. And so he, along with Board of Water Supply, secured funding to purchase these materials and fly them up to the work site. And due to weather conditions, we weren't able to install everything as soon as it was deployed. So it kind of sat up there for a while, and we did have to round up a lot of volunteers to help us install it, even though they're like really heavy and sopping wet after rains came through the area. So in March, we set up photo points, and we set up 10 photo points, 5 on each side of the ridge. So the Makaha side was in fairly, the slope on Makaha side was really steep, so we kept the photo points to the ridge top. While the Waianae Kai side, we were able to set the photo points along the slope, which made it a little trickier to find once the vegetation came back. And so we have 10 years worth of data on photo points. Not all of them were refound after some of the vegetation covered it. But as you'll see later on, you'll be able to see some of the progress of the photo points. So I believe the next slide will be for Tamara to talk about the monitoring efforts that they've done.
Great, thank you, Amy. So I wanted to emphasize that, just like Amy talked about, it really was a collaborative and multi-partner effort. And so beyond some of the contributions that Amy talked about, I just wanted to say that another thing that DOFA did was that they paid for 3 AmeriCorps interns that worked with us on the monitoring. And these were Waianae High School graduates who worked with us for about a year. Ka'ala Farms, Bruce Kidley was working with them at the time, and he came up every single week also to help out, and brought along sometimes the Waianae High School students and many other volunteers. Yeah, and we had many volunteers come up with the effort. So one of the things that we wanted to, Clay was talking about the prevalence of fires and where they're found and not so frequently in forests, but with the change in climate, I mean, they are found sometimes in the kind of Mesic forest in which it burned, but unfortunately, we can expect that this kind of thing may increase in the future. So it's really important to start to learn about what happens when you have a fire like this in a native Mesic forest. And one of the things that we did right away was try to set up some vegetation monitoring transects with permanent plots so that we can track what happens to the vegetation or what happened to the vegetation over time. So we started to set this up in March 2004. So I guess about, what's that, 6 months or so after the fire. That's Clay setting up. Another thing that, so what we ended up setting up was 56 2x2 meter permanent plots in that burn area that Amy showed you. And then to try to figure out what the forest should have looked like or would have looked like before it burned, we set up an additional 16 2x2 plots in the adjacent forest on either side of the burn. This is all on the Waianae Kai side. And one of the first things we did as well was try to figure out what was in the soil seed bank and so would have the potential to come back. And so we monitored the soil seed bank on multiple occasions, both in the burn and in the forest. As you can, oops, as you would have, sorry, that I just, sorry, how do I go back there? In the previous slide, you saw basically how the fire burned absolutely everything down. It was all just soil, and that's why we had those soil erosion materials put up there. But so one of the first things we wanted to do, even though vegetation was coming back, it was mostly non-native vegetation. There was koa. We wanted to be able to jumpstart that, and so outplant a bunch of species to see if we could help that effort. And so we chose species that were fruiting or seeding in the area at the time, and that were common, that we thought could survive in that kind of condition. And so we collected seeds of koa, maile, a'ali'i, ko'okolau, and alahe'e in June or July of 2004. And we had a big effort to grow these in greenhouses. A lot of volunteers. The DOFA Makiki Court Space Yard grew the koa And then we had volunteers at Leeward, Franny growing some of the other species at the Pahole as well, and then people growing things in their backyards as well. So these are from our interns at the time planting all the seeds that we were going to use for the outplants. And at the same time, you can sort of see, you'll see with Amy's photo points as well, but we had massive amounts of non-native vegetation coming back in. That's Paul standing with a bunch of Buddleia on the left, and these are some Waianae High School students weeding around some mamaki that had come up. But there was massive non-native vegetation coming back, and so starting in January of 2005, we had monthly volunteer trips to come up and remove the vegetation, and also to start planting. And here we started our first outplanting in March 2005, and our regeneration efforts with the Alahe'e and the Ko'oko'olau didn't work out. We didn't get enough seedlings. We got some seedlings, we outplanted them, we didn't get enough of them. So we ended up just outplanting mostly the Koa, Maile, and A'ali'i. And what we did to be able to test sort of the effects of whether it's worth it to outplant is that we outplanted each of these 3 species in exactly half of our plots. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Amy now.
We did a multi-agency effort to do weed control. So it was Oahu Invasive Species Committee, the Oahu Army Natural Resource Program, also the precursor to, well, the Ko'olau Mountains Watershed Partnership, because we didn't have the Waianae Partnership at that time. The Board of Water Supply and DLNR all chipped in to do some weed control. Our efforts, our focus was on the blackberry and the grass. And whenever other species that we found along the way, like Cydemia, Grevillea, Christmasberry, and all the other potentially bad weedy stuff, we also targeted when we were trying to do the blackberry control. We did about, I think, 7 or 8 different weed control efforts, and this picture is of one of the volunteer work trips that we had to outplant koa. So we had a pretty good turnout from the community as well as the organizations we worked with. So this picture is taken from 3 poles looking back towards the ocean, and you can see the light green patch. That's all the koa that regenerated within that burn site.
And yeah, now we're gonna try. Try to share screens and make Amy the presenter so that she can share with you some of her the photo points. So here we go, Amy.
Okay. Okay, is it working?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So this is a photo point 3, and for this photo point, we took several different aspects for the viewings. And so you can see some of the remnants of the soil erosion control material. It broke down within 6 months to a year, which is what it's rated for. So it did its job. It held the soil in place. And you can see the progression of plants that came in, native and non-native. So this is looking up towards the ridge top. So you can see how quickly, so that's the straw wattle in the burlap bag.
Which was like sprouting. We had like rice grass sprouting from the...
It was rice straw.
Rice straw, yeah.
You're not supposed to let it get wet before you install it, which what happened because of the rain. So you can see the koa come in.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I'll turn it over back to you.
Okay, sure.
Okay, did that work?
Yeah. So you can kind of just see the progression, and I think it sort of from non-native weeds to the kind of overstory filling in, and then if you notice the later points back to these kind of understory non-natives. And so we'll actually kind of look at the data now. I'll turn it back to Tamara to talk about what we found 14 years later.
Great, thank you. So like Clay mentioned, well, we had monitored our plots. We set them up in 2004. We monitored them through 2006, and then we actually stopped monitoring them. And then this year, we went back to see what happened. I brought a class up with me, and then grad students, obviously Clay and Amy were there too, and we remonitored all the plots. So these are some of the results I'm going to show you now. And you can see this is, of course, what the forest looks like right now with that big, tall overstory with the koa. Okay. So one of the questions we had was, of course, well, what came back naturally and when did it come back? So this table is looking at the native species and the date at which they were first observed. So what we found that within the first year, so before December 2004, koa, mamaki, naupaka, abikibike, these are, I have them in brown because they're woody, came back, along with a couple of other ferns. The koa, mamaki, and naupaka were the only species that we found in the seed bank, in the burn and also in the forest. And when I say found in the seed bank, what we did is we took soil cores at multiple times, and then we planted them in the greenhouse, and we looked at to see what germinated. And those were the only things that we found. Also in the forest plots, no other seeds in the seed bank. Over time, more ferns come in, the carex, the huehue, and then it was only a year and a half later that we start to see the polopolai, the ama'o, and ama'u. And then what I really want to point out actually is that between May 2005 and then our remonitor in March 2006, the only new native species that we found that wasn't there from May 2005 was moa. So nothing else new came in over that period of 12 years, native. And I guess the other thing that happened was that some of the natives that came up actually disappeared over time. And some of this is expected because, of course, they're pioneer species. They're not going to hang on. But other ones, like the naupaka, should have, and the gania should have continued because those are found in the adjacent forest. These are looking at the non-natives and when they were first observed. I don't want to go through the whole table, but just to point out that the timing of arrival of the grasses varied. Guinea grass was the first thing that came back, within that first year, then molasses grass, and now we see a lot of basket grass. A lot of asters came in right away, and then they disappeared over time. In terms of the woody stuff that was problematic, the buddleia came right away, and the blackberry, unfortunately, came also within that first year. And then by a year later, strawberry guava first appeared, and the Christmas berry. And now when we go back, we see additional species, tuna and common guava. They're not very big at this point, actually, but they are there as well. Sorry. Okay, so another question we had was, well, how well were the species in the forest able to recolonize that burned area, right? But as Amy pointed out, the burn wasn't actually such a big area, and it's surrounded on all sides, on either side, by this fairly intact native forest. So these are the species that the native species, well, these are the species that we found in the overstory of our plots in the forest. And what we found over the 14-year period, that the only species that were in the forest that recolonized the burn and stayed was the koa and the strawberry guava, okay? So this is actually kind of disappointing. Even the a'ali'i and the maile, which were in the adjacent forest, none of it came in on its own. We planted it out there and it survived, as you'll see, but nothing came by on its own. And in terms of the other species, we wouldn't expect them to come right away, of course. They would need a shady canopy and whatnot. As I mentioned, the naupaka came and it went, but nothing else colonized over time, even now with the shade. In terms of the understory species that were in the adjacent forest, so I should point out, sorry, that the orange ones are the non-native species. And we did get some more, or high level, I would say, of the number of species that were colonizing. So all of the ones in the red circle we find in the forest, the burn site today. So that's some of the ferns, the gania, the grass carex, and a few of those non-native understory species. Okay. We were interested in looking at how the whole composition of that burned area shifts over time. And this is a multivariate technique, non-metric dimensional scaling, that allows us to look at that composition of all the community at the same time. And so I'm happy to talk about this if people have questions after, but basically every little point on this, every number is one of our plots, okay? And all the plots that we monitored in 2004 are in red, 2005 are in orange, and you can see how the community is shifting over time from 2004 to 2005 because they're separated in space along both axes. I didn't circle the yellow, I don't know if you can see that, that's 2006, but that, again, the community shifts again. And then when we go back in 2017, those are all those points, those are our exact same plots. Those are what the community, they represent the community composition in 2017, okay? And the blue is the adjacent forest. So basically what we see from this graph is that the community composition is shifting over time, but it's not shifting back towards what the forest was, okay? So it's its own new thing. And this is another photo of what that forest looks like right now. And so when we look at our plots, here's a little bit more detail on what it looks like. So as you could see from that photo, basically you've got a native overstory. It's dominated by koa and a'ali'i and some maile. Again, the a'ali'i and the maile are all the outplants. There's nothing there that wasn't outplanted, besides a couple of maile keiki. And then you've got some non-natives like the strawberry guava and some tuna, but they're really quite low in comparison to the rest of the numbers of the native canopy. But when you look at the graph on the right, you see the opposite trend, where the orange is all, this is the percent of understory cover. So you've got close to 70% non-native understory cover and less than 10% of native understory cover. Right, so you've got a native overstory and you've got a non-native understory. All right, one of our really big questions was, what effect did the outplanting effort have? And I do want to emphasize that the outplanting effort was a really big effort. For anybody who knows, any of you who've been up to that site, it's not an easy site to access. It's a very steep hike. It takes what, about an hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on. And we carted up all those outplants and planted them up out there. So we had a lot of volunteers. I recently looked up the number of volunteer hours we had. What did I tell you, Clay?
740.
740 volunteer hours in terms of planting and also weeding. And a big limitation to how much we could plant was basically how much we could weed, because there was no point planting unless we could be weeding it regularly as well. So again, was it worth it? These photos just show the trajectory of a'ali'i. So we planted it in March 2005. This is December on the left, 2005. Then this is a year later, 2006 in the middle, and then this is what the a'ali'i looks like now. Big, beautiful.
There's some big ones there.
Very beautiful, yeah, 2017. Okay, so to our surprise, actually, maile and a'ali'i survival was really quite high. So on the y-axis, you can see the percent survived, and in the light green is how much survived in that first year, when you just usually when you get a lot of mortality, right? So 2005 to 2006. And then the dark green bar beside it is how much of those survived from 2006 through to now to 2017, so the next 11-year period. And amazingly, for a'ali'i, we see really high survival, so more than 80% survived that first year, and then of those that were left in 2006, more than 80% of them are there today. So it had really fabulous survival. Maile had really pretty good as well. Anybody who's worked with maile, I was quite surprised by this. 70-some survival in the first year, and then still over 50% of those that were there in 2006 are there still today, and they are big, and we did see them fruiting, and we did see some local regeneration keiki were coming up with some of the plots from the seeds that had dropped. So this was really exciting, actually, especially since these things were planted, and then we weeded them in the next year, but then we had no maintenance after that. So, okay, so the other big story here was that koa really did terribly. Only 40% of all the koa we outplanted survived the first year. And then of those that were left, only like 30% survived between 2006 and 2017. Okay, so you had really low levels of survival for the koa. And koa was a really big question for us anyway, because when we first had this idea to do the outplanting, it was just mostly barren soil. But of course, over time, a lot of things came in, a lot of the non-natives, but a lot of koa was regenerating. So this is what it looked when we started to outplant in March of 2005. But you can see January in 2005, there's a lot of koa coming back, and they're growing well. So we were really asking ourselves at that point, it was too late to go back on it, but like, why are we outplanting koa, and is it even worth it to be outplanting the koa? And so it was really interesting. And then we had so much mortality. But it was really interesting to look at our results now, and because what we found actually is that if you now today 2017, our plots that were outplanted actually had more naturally regenerated koa than the plots that were not outplanted. Okay, so we've got the number of naturally regenerated koa on the y-axis, and then in the dark green is the number of wild koa that are there in those plots today. Okay, and the light green is the number of outplants. So you can see on the right, basically we've got way more koa in the outplanted plots, but most of that isn't due to what we outplanted, that light green, it's due to all that naturally regenerated. And in a separate analysis, we also found that the probability of even having a koa in a plot was higher for an outplanted plot than a non-outplanted plot. So something is going on here, and we are not sure why this happened. We have some thoughts on it. One is that, and this is one that people bring up, is that maybe the outplanted plots were just more weeded than the non-outplanted plots. And I actually don't think that's true, because we did consistent weeding every time we monitored, and every time through all the plots in terms of the native species. And also, if we look at the data, we found equal numbers of koa, natural, regenerated right from 2005 through to 2006 when we were doing the weeding. So I don't think it's possible that that's the answer. Another possibility is that we've got really steep slopes and a lot of very loose soil that was washing off, maybe with the planting of the a'ali'i and the maile, and the koa was stabilizing the soil a bit more and allowing, I don't know. Another possibility is that our koa that were outplanted were inoculated with mycorrhizae, and then they were planted into there, so perhaps that was also facilitating. Anyway, welcome thoughts on this. Okay, so all this to say that when we look at our plots right now, outplanted plots have higher basal area of natives than the non-outplanted. That's the koa and the ali'i, basically. They have more native species, but basically that's just because they've got the maile and the ali'i there. But there's no difference in the understory, okay? So both, whether it's a non-outplanted or control plot or an outplanted plot, the native species understory cover is very low, and the overstory cover is very high, reaching up to 100%. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that, you know, we do have some understory natives in the plots, and I did point those out, but I do want to say that they're actually, the species are there, but they're in a very small number of plots. So we've got the proportion of plots on the y-axis here, and you can see that koa, mai, and ali'i, and even maile are found in a fair number of the plots. But then you look at these understories, palapalai, ama'u, pala'a, etc. They're found in, you know, less than 10% of the plots. So that's very few plots. And then, you know, if we look at what has happened over time, the light green is the number of plots they were found in 2006. So it's actually decreased over time as well. So I mean, there was more originally, and now there's less. Okay, so these are just a few thoughts we have on the lessons learned from looking at this trajectory. And again, we don't have really very much to compare it to in terms of a Mesic forest at that elevation. That's a native forest that's burned. So one, the number of native species naturally recolonizing was very low. Again, we had very few species we found in the soil seed bank. There were native pioneer species that colonized, but they were not replaced over time by native shade tolerant species. And again, not even the a'ali'i or the maile recolonized naturally. The a'ali'i was producing a lot of seeds at the time. Those are the ones that we collected to be able to outplant, but those seeds also, when they see the plant, get a lot of predation, and so possibly that's a reason for that. It looks like from our data that the outplanting effort really was worth it. The survival was really, I think, remarkably high for the maile and the a'ali'i, despite little or no maintenance over that long time period. Or some maintenance, but relatively little. the outplanting seems to have fostered the regeneration and survival of the wild koa. And so in the end, what you have is more natives than the outplanted. And then finally, the weeding was critical. I mean, the outplants would not have survived at all without it. But it needs to happen again. So we have this beautiful koa canopy, but we have an understory, and I guess I'd say outlet canopy as well, but an understory dominated by invasive species with very little native regeneration. And I want to emphasize as well, not just little native understory species, but no regeneration of woody species that will make it up to the canopy. And when we were giving this presentation to DOFA, folks brought up that it does look very beautiful, but at the same time, it's not necessarily very resilient for us, because if anything happens to the koa, there's nothing there is going to take its place. So at the same time, it's because you get this beautiful, nice, shady canopy, it is also a wonderful moment to think about helping to foster that next stage. And I'm going to turn it back to Clay now.
Right. So I think, again, we're trying to always frame the work that we're doing in Hawaii in the context of fire about these efforts on the mainland. And this idea of fire-adapted landscapes and communities, we talked about sort of the majority of these fires started by people, but I think from the landscape perspective, just what Tamara said in that last comment was, how are our landscapes sort of resilient to fire? And I think that this work at least kind of contributes a lot to some of the stuff that's built on knowledge from like Rhonda Lowe's work, for example, at Volcano, and that we can see that some of our native species actually are resilient, that we can kind of work with them to facilitate recovery at these areas. And so this idea, like, again, knowledge is a two-way street, is trying to line up this idea with what do we know from the management perspective, and then how can we use research to facilitate future management and improve what we're doing. And so we have, in this case, something kind of a really strong foundation to work with. I mean, you get out there, and if you never knew there was a fire, I've walked through the site with people, and you don't even realize you're in the burn site because that koa canopy is so well established. But thinking about the longer term trajectory of the site and its potential, what's going to happen out there is still sort of up in the air. But it does provide some things to work with. And you can see from this picture just what that koa can look like. It also is kind of an interesting shot here because you can see in some of the areas, so this is by the LZ, where we didn't do outplanting. There's a lot of patches that are open and they're pretty well dominated by, this is molasses grass. And so trying to get a sense of what it could have looked like had we done nothing, right? And so I think it just kind of speaks to this idea that we can work with the species that we have. We can work with the knowledge of restoration that we also have, and apply it into this sort of different scenario here. So a fire that's in a Mesic forest, and try to understand what the outcomes are, and where we need to move to next. And so in terms of how this can inform response in the future to these areas, this is some ideas that Amy and Tamara and I have kind of sat around thinking about. Is like, I think erosion control is important, clearly. We had the ability in this case to implement some form of erosion control with those barriers. I've delved into the literature on erosion control, post-fire erosion control, and the best approach out there is mulching, actually, to actually cover the soil with something. But at least we know that you can have an impact in preventing erosion through this post-fire response. And then this idea of initial weed control to promote overstory tree establishment. And I've had lots of conversations with Rhonda at the National Park and Volcano about the need to kind of get in there quick. If you do have natural regeneration of koa or other species happening, you got to give them like a leg up, knock the weeds back at the very beginning, and then probably do some follow-up in the intervening years, 1 to 3 years afterwards. And then as the species coming in and establishing, you're going to have to prioritize certain species over others. So a lot of the herbaceous stuff, like even the Buddleia actually, which is kind of woody, kind of faded out on its own over time. And there's other herbaceous stuff that come in that you're not really going to have to worry about. But some of these other woody canopy trees that we do know we have to worry about kind of get up on that list as far as priorities. So these are like tuna, and I think that if we had any folks from Ko'olau on the call here, they can talk about their effort right now, Kipapa Fire over in the Ko'olau Mountains, about how they're seeing shifts in what woody species they need to target over time. And then medium term, obviously we saw with this data that outplanting overstories species can enhance that long-term canopy establishment, right? So we're not sure what's going on exactly, but that we do know that we have higher canopy cover in these areas where we were actively outplanting. It also increased diversity, right? So even though it's not crazy diverse, it's 3 species, but that's, you know, 3 times as many as we would have had had we just let it go on its own. And then we see this shift in weed control, again, to focus on some of these other problem species. So Amy was pointing out that those later weeding trips were really focused on the rubus, which is getting quite thick, Clydemia, strawberry guava, which you can actually see kind of creeping in from the edges. So you get more strawberry guava along these plots that are on the edges of the fire, for example. And now over the long term, it's this, I mean, I think the data clearly shows that you need to shift gears, and that if you're not thinking about understory restoration, it's not really going to happen, right? You're going to kind of just stuck with that beautiful overstory, but the understory is pretty much a thicket of Clydemia. So it definitely needs some intervention there. And those are kind of the take homes that we've come up with, and we're happy to kind of turn this over to questions at this point. I'd really like to thank Amy and Tamara for presenting the information they did, and also kind of motivating well, Tamara really motivating us to get out there and resample these plots. I think it was a cool opportunity to kind of understand. And again, this is really special because the work to date, the numbers and data we have is really coming from primarily from wet forest, right? And so now we're able to see how that differs, and maybe how we need to change our strategies and understand the process of post-fire recovery and rehabilitation in these Mesic areas. So with that, I will shift over to the audience. Now I feel like I should unmute you all so we can have a little round of applause, but I won't do that. If we can, you can raise your hand, and I got the controls here. I can see who's on the horn here. We can turn it over to questions for you guys. If there are any. Oh, we got a hand raised here. Julia, I'm gonna unmute you. Hi, Julia.
Oops, I think that might have been a little bit of a mistake, but I do have a question.
No, I have.
Oh, you had it. Never mind.
No, you go. We got multiple questions.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I was curious about, so it was about 7 to 9 acres. How many plants did you plant, and planting densities, and what your thoughts were about that going into it?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually ended up, we collected about 300 to 500 seeds for each of the species, and then we grew those out. But we ended up outplanting only about 300 individuals, and part of our limitation was that there was no point outplanting them unless we could do the weeding effort. And so that was one of our big limitations. And then in terms of outplanting densities, we didn't really have a good, what we did is we planted, I guess I'd just say that within a 2x2 plot, we planted 3 individuals in each 2x2. So they're sort of spaced in that way. So 1 Maile, 1 Koa, and 1 A'ali'i, each within a 2x2 plot.
Okay, got it. Taylor here has a question as well. Taylor Marsh.
Hi. I was wondering about if you guys noticed any noticeable soil erosion that occurred. Yeah, as a first part.
Yeah, that's a great question, Clay.
Yeah, well, we definitely noticed erosion, and it was pretty apparent from so we had actually set these plots up initially to try to suss out if that erosion had effect, the barriers were effective, and you could just see, like, anecdotally that the barriers were working, and I forget, I haven't passed it tomorrow, there was some effect on the density of plants establishing where you had more plants coming up in the areas that had the erosion barrier, but it wasn't like favoring native over non-native. It's just kind of the weeds that were coming in thicker. It was a tough thing. We actually, this is something that none of us really are proud to talk about, but I'll say this, we actually tried to set up some of these erosion channels. And so Jonathan Dinick, who's a soil scientist here at UH, and I were talking about how to do this, and he had mentioned a technique, and the next time I went up, climbed up the mountain, there's all this equipment that someone had I think Board of Water had airlifted up there. So I called him up, we actually set one of these things up, but the terrain was just too steep for it to work. Yeah, we tried it because the stuff was there, but basically we were like digging these trenches and putting and flashing to try to channel the erosion down. And at any rate, it was a bit of a mess, but so.
But the answer is yes, there was definitely a lot of erosion happening. I think the barriers did stop some of it. You could see them piling up, but they did seem to catch both native and non-native seeds and allow for higher generation of both.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, I noticed, I read something about the remnant ash that remained on the ground kind of kept soil from eroding for a little while. Did you guys notice that? And then after a certain amount of time, it started building up on the barriers?
I'd have to pass that up to Amy, because Amy would have been in there sort of short term after, as far as any of the ash. And that does have an effect from what people have looked at in the literature, but it tends to be short term because it gets blown off and washed off pretty quickly. But Amy, do you recall any observations related to that?
I do recall seeing koa seeds come up within a week through the, that ashy layer. But on the slopes, I don't recall if we had rain once we put in the soil erosion control material. I know some of the barriers did overtop, so the slope was so steep that whatever did come off was held back by the erosion control material, but then it topped over the height of that log, which is about a foot high. But yeah, I'm not sure about the ash itself, whether that, with the rain, if it compacted to prevent any more erosion.
Yeah, I was going to say, by the time we put in the veg plots, the ash was pretty much gone.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I'm just wondering how much of a window, as far as like a management implication for future, fire sites, like how much of a window of that stable ground that you have where you can go in and do some real restoration stuff.
Yeah, so it's quick, right? Because it's pretty much just the next time. So the biggest driver of rainfall, or sorry, erosion, is the direct impact of raindrops to the soil. And so that's why they found that the mulching is the best strategy, because it actually will prevent the raindrops from hitting the soil and loosening things up. And so it works better than doing erosion bars or anything like that.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting.
Yeah. But again, all that work. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go.
I was going to say that work's mostly been done kind of in the western U.S., the mountains in the western U.S. That they've actually been able to measure the effects of those different strategies.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I was also wondering about if you guys had thought about or read anything on polyacrylamide. I don't know if I'm saying it right. It's kind of like a synthetic polymer used as like a binding agent as soil erosion control.
Yeah, I've read a little bit about it. Again, I think that was one of the treatments that have been compared in these studies, and the best thing that they found is wood mulch. Straw mulch and wood mulch is even better. And of course, we have issues with mulch here as far as like where you get it, and then if you're going to get it from someplace else, now we've got coconut rhinoceros beetle stuff to deal with. But at any rate, yeah, it's a challenge. I think you brought it up, that window, right, that you have, because you're basically racing the rains, and it sort of happens. It seems to happen all the time where you get these big fires. I mean, in the Waianae, the fire that happened this November, I mean, it was flash flood warnings the week after, right? So it's, I don't know, you get these 1-2 punches all the time here. So, but that ability to kind of be prepared to be able to respond quickly is really critical. And in fact, the federal agencies, so Fish and Wildlife and the national parks, U.S. Forest Service, have funds in place. They call it emergency response, and typically that's dealing with soil erosion, like within those first within that first month of a fire, short-term rapid response. And then the rehabilitation side is kind of the longer-term plan, which was what essentially we were tracking here.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah.
Mute us.
What question? Carolyn, do you have a question? I'll mute you.
Yes. Did you consider, or has anyone ever tried exploring the effect that a native seed scatter might have in a site like this? Right after the fire, especially if you had the ability to mulch it all, or is there any kind of research that you know that's been done? I know my counterparts on the mainland, when there's a fire, they have seed mixtures that they know are effective at vegetating these sites, and just wondering if you guys had thought about or looked at or are considering that for maybe a future project.
I'll just say, thank you for the question. I'll say something, I'm going to turn it then to Clay, but I will say that we did consider, we talked about, it would have been much easier for us in some ways to scatter seeds, but at our site the slope was just too steep and the erosion was way too much that it would not have been effective. I mean, I actually do remember, especially when we started up, there was some massive rains, right, when all the soil was just running off. So no, it couldn't have worked at that early stage, at least at our site. But I'll turn it to Clay because we probably have some other examples.
Well, I know that, you know, I think the biggest limitation for seed scattering is like getting the seeds. And actually, the Plant Materials Center on Molokai, I've talked to them a bunch of times about this because that's the technique they were trying to Kaho'olawe, right? It's growing out all these natives, sort of basically farming native plants to get high quantities of seed that you could then scatter out at sites. And so Kaho'olawe restoration folks would probably have the most experience, but I do know that other restoration sites, not post-fire necessarily, but people are trying it. But I think the biggest limitation just tends to be seed availability. I will say that that's also has been considered a treatment and for erosion control. And the consensus basically is that it just doesn't happen fast enough to have an effect. The plants don't establish fast enough to have an effect on erosion, but it definitely has potential, I think, to facilitate the post-fire recovery, you know, getting natives out and established quickly.
Yeah, I'd imagine you'd have to do it in combination with a mulch and just, you know, kind of thinking outside of the box, like, you know, if you had some place where you could get even, you know, fairly common or native species. Here on the Big Island, there's, you know, acres that are overrun with ali'i. If you could even mulch that together with the flowers if they were there and get the seeds in the mix and then put it out. But two, I don't know where slope limitation is for mulching, that it'll still be effective also. I mean, I think you get to a certain point of steepness and even mulch would be difficult to keep on site. So just thinking out loud, just wondering.
Yeah, no, thanks for the comments.
Yeah, it's a great question.
And I think JB Friday here has I could unmute you if you'd like to contribute, but JB was saying what were the overall goals of erosion control versus getting these commons established? And I think that it was kind of all of the above, but that he just notes that there are efforts with the state, with DOFA now, to try to increase the number of common species being raised in seed banking, as well as just getting nurseries to be growing them out just for these kinds of responses, because a lot of that effort tends to be focused on rare and endangered plants, and so having kind of a stock of these common seeds is really important for efforts like this. JB, did I miss anything? You want me to? I can unmute you. Here, sorry.
Am I on, Clay?
Yeah, you're on.
Oh, okay. Well, because of the fires, I mean, this issue of getting native seed for fires, DOFA is statewide now. Well, various agencies are working on seed banks. There's a statewide effort of seed banks, and like we were just last year up in the park looking at their seed bank. They have an entire refrigerator full of mamani seed now for restoration, and so the commons like Ko Mamani Ali are being banked in, you know, by the many kilos of seed for being able to do larger restoration projects here.
Yeah, it's like that. Everyone, I think, when the fire happens, it's almost the same thing as suppression is very reactive, and we're trying to figure out this is exactly contributing to that effort to increase preparedness before these things happen. The timing for this fire was a little bit just uncanny, where you had this, you know, as Amy was explaining, this kind of group of folks that were really interested in, you know, working on forest restoration and native habitat rehabilitation, and suddenly there was this sort of events to rally around. So it was kind of perfect timing for this site. Thanks, JB.
Clay, I found a picture of the burn site about 4 months after, and it does show some erosion areas, and the ash layer is still sort of visible. So I don't know if you want me to...
Turning it over to you right now.
All right. Okay, can you see it?
Yeah.
So you can kind of see some of the erosion happening, and then some remnants of the ash layer here. So this is in January, and the fire happened in September. Oh, no, yeah, September. So I don't know if that helped with Taylor's question.
Chris has a question. I'm going to just unmute you, Chris. Chris Brocious from the Waianae Mountain Watershed Partnership.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm thinking about the end result of the hard work that everybody does in the restoration and weed suppression phases, and I'm wondering if there have been any, you know, well, a little bit more, you know, we're all worried about the investment of added weed control for the understory control phase. And, you know, like that comment that Dofa had made saying, you have a beautiful overstory, but what about the weeds? And that'll ultimately kind of inherit that area because it suppresses regeneration of the understory and the new overstory ultimately. So I'm wondering if there are any studies or restoration efforts that go for like a very high density canopy planting early on, where you know that it's not the natural density that's going to happen, but it's going to shade out things as fast as possible, and maybe half of your initial plantings may survive and outcompete other plantings to maturity, but you shade out everything. And then meanwhile, your kind of like your history of which weeds will ultimately rise up in the understory. Maybe you should have like a zero tolerance policy on, say, clidemia. You know, as soon as it rears its head, you try and snuff that out, and then maybe not worry about the herbaceous species or other species that may eventually senesce or die out on their own. So I guess, yeah, simply put, do you know of any research into high density plantings to limit understory weeds? And I guess that's my real question.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of people I think are still on the call here that might know something about this. So the best example that comes to mind, and I looking through here, Rhonda and Sierra McDaniel, but at the volcano, what comes to my mind immediately is the broom sedge fire. And again, keep in mind, like, this burn site was, you know, between 8 to 10 acres. There, they did some post-fire response in a site that was about 1,000 acres, right? So it's trying to scale this up. And I don't know if I can try to unmute. It doesn't look like Rhonda has phone connection, but where'd she go? But it looks like maybe, Sierra, would you mind kind of speaking to what was going on about sort of what you guys did, your approach in that site? I'm going to unmute you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, for broom sedge in particular?
Well, just that idea, you guys, the approach that you guys took of those high density, I think Rhonda calls them the nodes, high density planting effort at those sites. But whatever comes to mind for you.
Yeah, I mean, it was, so for broom sedge, it was 1,000 acres, and, you know, you can't plant every, you know, inch of that space. And so what we were trying to do is inoculate the area with basically a grid of plots. So we ended up putting in, I think, somewhere around 825 plots across that area, and different ones got different concentrations. But you still end up with, you know, we weren't changing the understory necessarily. You're still dealing with, you know, high densities of invasive grasses, but you are increasing the native biodiversity and structure in those areas. And so the idea is that you get these species in and established, and that they would be creating a seed bank before your next fire, just because you are going to have these invasive grasses that are there. So it's inevitable that there will be a fire at some point in the future. But that also is plays into the species that we chose for the restoration, as well as that they're fire tolerant species, so that they would be able to, you know, recolonize or resprout after that fire. So I think for that one, we put in a couple million seeds and somewhere around 18,000 plants. Yeah, does that answer your question?
I guess so. I appreciate that it increased the native density and the structure and your seed bank, but it sounds like it may have had a negligible effect on the understory weed suppression. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the Ohia woodlands, that's where this broom sedge fire happened, where it's in seasonally dry Ohia woodlands. And so it is more of an open environment, you know, originally, you know, compared to a koa forest, let's say, where it'd be a bit more closed. In our Ohia koa forest restoration, we actually are doing dense plantings with the intent that will change the light environment and shade out those grasses. And you can do that by blocking about 95% of the light. But you do still have, you know, strawberry guava and ginger and blackberry that are not going to be shaded out. And so those would be weeds that you would have to, you know, maintain.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sierra.
Yeah, and there's different, I mean, we're dealing, you know, different grasses have different light thresholds as well. So the one that has the highest, that can grow in the, you know, the darkest forest is the Earharta, the meadow rice grass. But some of the others, like Kikuyu, is more like around, you know, blocking about 80%. So it kind of just depends on what, you know, what you're dealing with. But A'ali'i actually has, for us, has been really great at suppressing grasses. So it's too bad that the A'ali'i survival wasn't better, but koa alone, we haven't seen where it can really do that unless it's in a really, really dense stand.
Yeah, it's kind of these wispy here. I mean, even there, you're still getting light coming through. But fortunately, a lot of the grasses, these C4 grasses that we're dealing with, are fairly shade intolerant. But then you're worried about what it shifts to. So that this site, from what we found, for example, those non-native understory sites were predominantly Claytonia.
Yeah, I mentioned.
Yeah.
And yeah, and JB has a couple comments here, basically that the broom sedge, he's just reinforcing what Sierra said, that you actually, yeah, so koa, no matter how dense, won't shade out Claytonia. So that's really shade tolerant. And then these woody invasives weren't as prevalent at the broom sedge fire. It was more the broom sedge, you know, these grasses that were.
But in that broom sedge fire, we do weed sweeps every other year for blackberry and faya Faya tree is the biggest one in there. So if we didn't do that, it would turn into a Faya forest. But that's pretty much all the Ohio woodlands.
Right, right.
Fire or no fire.
Cool. Thanks, Sierra. I'm happy to have had you on for that question.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're kind of over time here. If there's any other questions, I think we'll have to kind of wait and contact me directly. I can put you in touch with Tamara or Amy. And I really thank you guys for attending. I just wanted to give you a heads up that we sort of have set up this system to shoot you guys a follow-up email saying thanks. And we have a survey in there, so hopefully you guys can take 5 minutes to fill out. It just helps us understand how well we're doing and how we can improve this in the future. And it sounds like we might have to have Sierra and Ron to do a webinar sometime soon about what their experience in these large-scale areas. I mean, again, this is scaling up again, much larger fires they've been dealing with over there relative to this fire in the Waianaes. But thanks everyone again for attending. And if you've got questions, feel free to email me directly. And yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.